Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out ISO. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. This episode is powered by Dr. Ray Gorman, founder of Engage Movement. Learn how to boost your income without relying on sessions. Get a free training on the blended practice model by following at Ray Gorman DPT on Instagram. Rob, Tex, Tim, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you all today. For people who aren't familiar with you, would you mind filling them in a bit about who you are and all the amazing stuff you're doing?
Yeah, so what's up, everyone? My name is Rob Nelson. I'm an athletic performance coach at Penn State University. I oversee softball and swimming. I also do some consulting work in the professional rugby world. That's something that I've kind of relatively gotten into pretty recently. But I've worked private sector for a long time. I worked in professional sports, and most recently, 5 or 6 years, been working in collegiate athletics. So kind of had a full background on different things. So pretty excited to be here. We've got a great group and a great episode.
Tex McQuilkin with captains and coaches. So coaching high school lacrosse is a passion project, but then traveling the world, teaching coaches how to teach people. And that's where we're diving into today.
Awesome. Tim, Kelly, probably 8+ years in the private sector, worked for a place called Virginia High Performance for a while. I kind of do substitute coaching now for a couple different gyms like Beach Fitness and Performance and Ienga Sports Performance here in the Tidewater, Virginia Beach area. And just over a year ago, I got into the fire service with Virginia Beach, kind of chasing some personal goals and career development of my own as well. But I still do all the coaching stuff on the side as well. So it's been quite fun. And I've been a performance nerd for a long time. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you gentlemen today about the weeds.
Absolutely. The three of you are amongst the smartest people I know, all multiple time past podcast guests that way. And essentially, I've had this concept of skill development on my mind for several months now. I think, Rob, you and I have talked about it at length here on and off over that time. And it's just this concept of understanding the work that we do, whether that be in the weight room as an S&C or as a PT or AT, even whatever your title is per se, the carryover and impact it has to an actual motor learning and skill development standpoint. I think for the longest time, when I looked at something like a squat or a lunge, I just looked at it kind of like I was taught in school. Well, it's going to strengthen the quads. It's going to build bigger muscles. And then over time, I started to evolve my thought process and think, what makes someone so naturally good at squats or good at lunges? And why is that person better at them than someone else? And how did they learn that skill at a more rapid rate than other individuals that way? And I think there's a lot of different factors that influence one's ability to gain that skill, to move through a pattern competently within a short amount of time. Now more than ever, I feel like strength and conditioning coaches are facing a growing pressure to produce those type of results very rapidly. There's a lot of changes and evolution occurring in the sports space, both in high school and college, where athletes are expected to learn these skills very quickly. And if they don't, they seem to be blaming the S&C for that. I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on this concept of skill acquisition through movement that way. What might lead someone to develop skills quicker than others that way? And why is it so essential for us to start looking at physical movements through a skill lens instead of just a purely bigger, faster, stronger lens, if you will?
I'll hop in there. I mean, I think just because of the modern ecosystem and the way a lot of public schools deal with like recreational education and like physical education, and just like the way that the administrative principals go about it now, and especially I think it really changed during the COVID period when everything went online. We're having to kind of substitute a lot of that time development that was done in earlier ages and by kind of a public institution, and we're having to kind of do both, right? So people are coming at a later training age at say 12 or 14 or 16. They maybe miss, especially if they were, in a critical age window where they're more plastic and learning all of those things, say like in that 6 to 8 year old range. And they missed that because they were, online learning and they didn't get as much movement and outside time. So we're trying to have, instead of getting into more training education and getting them through that process of the training age progressions, we're having to supplement a lot of that stuff that, say, maybe 20 years ago, people got a lot more of just naturally in the ecosystem that they were experiencing, whether that was playing outside with their friends, manhunt, tag, going to the park more. That's just kind of one of the things we have to navigate with the digital age, I think.
Yeah, I can kind of jump in here too. No, I agree with Tim. Like I keep telling, like, and I work in the college sector, so a lot of these like athletes, a little bit older, but to that point, like, you missed a ton of time during the pandemic and that kind of like just development period, right? And like kids just don't play anymore. It's all about like specializing, right? It's kind of like what softball team can I play with year round, right? Like, like some of these sports are even crazy. It's like 11-month seasons, right? They get 1 month kind of off a year, and then it's like kind of in the middle of the year, and it's like all this development, that kind of stuff. But I also think kind of like just from a like pragmatic solution standpoint, for me, a lot of this stuff I think is just the variability that you're inherently trying to influence, right? So we talk about building better movers and acquiring skill, even in kind of like fundamental patterns, you're kind of doing different things. For me, the way that I'm going to kind of task my athletes to kind of do a lot of these things is to just inherently create a ton of different patterning in a similar pattern, right? So if we're squatting, we're doing a lot of variations of doing those things. If we're loading in a lot of different ways and that kind of thing. I think a lot of times when you look at like development, a lot of the way that these patterns are typically seen is like you're done in a box, right? So to your point, Dan, it's like, hey, like this is how you're going to squat. This is kind of the correct form. Like this is what we're looking for. But we know like with, limb length and personality and previous like, injury and like all these different things, just me a lot of different factors, right? So when we talk about kind of building competence and skill and doing different things, I think kind of supplementing with a lot of training and trying to effectively create the most variation in your training is going to kind of effectively build that.
Connecting with those a little bit, like all sports seasons, they begin with fundamentals. So that's something a sport coach can't argue with. They'll agree with you. So if you're in a position to try to win weight room time, then lead with that. How do you begin your season? They're going to say fundamentals. It's going to be the key thing. And then in respect to skill acquisition, a lot of sport coaches, they have their season playbook. Hey, practice 1 through 30 are already mapped out. They're going back to their same playbook over and over, pre-COVID, post-COVID. This is the system. It's one for them in the past. It's going to work. But like you mentioned, we have different kids. So if I want to win weight room time, then I'm presenting squat, step, lunge, different variations of the squat. These are the fundamentals of the fundamentals. So if we're talking about baseball, help present the connections between the squat or the crossover step as soon as they're taken off out of the box. So aiming to take your movements that you want to do within respect to strength and conditioning and find the connection for the sport coach to start create that bridge and that argument. Because the kids are changing. Like we see this physically, and I've witnessed it firsthand behaviorally. The middle school group that was out during COVID 2 years, their first year with a professional coach was their freshman year. So middle school, it's an incredible important for behavior and becoming an athlete, because you're handed off to a middle school coach in sport. Because before that, sport is dad coach, dad pitch, or mom's helping out with the teams. So middle school is the first time that parents are now independent, and you got those dads that got to go to right field because they're losing their mind during a middle school baseball game. So I just had a lot of troubles in my town when that freshman group came in that missed 2 years of having this separation from parents. So yeah, we're seeing a reverberation physically, mentally, emotionally from that missed time, and that now those kids are seniors. So it's going to be interesting even at the highest performance level at the high school, and seeing how they develop from there. And yeah, they missed behavior, they missed skill work, they missed so much in that time frame. So it's tough to make up ground, but with great understanding and our social intelligence and how we can help our coaches argue for more weight room time versus the obsession with, they need more skill, they need more specialization, they need more practice, and then weight room time gets cut. Or my favorite, when I was at the college level, you just get a call down from the sport coach, had to make these guys run 2 miles. They were being jerks today. Stay off their legs. It's hilarious, but yeah, that's why we're here.
Absolutely. No, and I think a big portion of this from a skillfulness and just movement strategy standpoint at least in my opinion, there's a small element of it that's predetermined, but the majority of these things are going to emerge over time. They're going to emerge from the athlete actually doing things. They're going to emerge from them interacting with others, doing repetitions over and over again, engaging in various environments, and so on that way. And Tex, building off your last point there, in relation to some of the high school athletes, I've seen them developing these quote unquote sport specific skills at extremely rapid rates. So much so that some of them, many of them, I should say, are significantly more skilled at their sport than they are just moving in general capacities. I can't tell you how many athletes I see sprint just without any kind of sport implement, no lacrosse stick in hand, no field hockey stick in hand. And I just look at them and I'm like, how did you get to the level of competition that you're at when that's your straight line linear sprint for 20 yards? How did we get these athletes to this point where they, I've been told the correct way to squat, yet for some reason they're not able to do it because of the lack of development they've had around that basic fundamental movement pattern and the lack of depth around that movement pattern, right? There's a phrase that I know Eric Hernandez says all the time, inch wide, mile deep. For some reason, we seem to have gone an inch wide, mile deep on the sport skills, but have forgot all of the fundamentals, to use your term, that it's taken for the athlete to even get there in the first place. So I feel like part of our skill acquisition from an S&C standpoint is literally re-ingraining some of these various skills that the athletes should have from a developmental standpoint, right? When they're young, when they're 1-2 years old, they can all squat through a full range really good. Somewhere along the lines that got lost because it wasn't trained. And now we have to go back and kind of re-engage them in some of these varied skill patterns that they almost lost along the way. And I feel like there's an art and science to doing that. I know, Rob, you mentioned about the variability piece and giving multiple variations of the same pattern. I guess my first thought about that is how many variations of a movement are we comfortable with, or how much is acceptable, right? Is 2 variations of the squat enough? Do I have to go 5? Do I have to keep it with 1? And what signifies that the athlete is ready for more variation?
Going through some of my personal experiences, I learned just how much of motor skill is learned in the right hemisphere of the brain. That's typically considered like our creative side. And, even just the words that we in these mental constructs we've set up in the performance sphere, like, is very analytical and left brain. And there's all these constraints and constructs. And a lot of us have dove many years into scientific literature and trying to understand these deeper topics to help bring it out into this more integrated, creative, holistic thing. And then the thing we're talking about right now is like, well, how do we get these kids to present these kind of natural, creative, intuitive, capacity in terms of movement, right? Movement expression and skill and all those things. And anyways, in the picture of, you can kind of see where that's the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. So my point with that is it starts with like the lexicon and verbiage that you build as a coach and like the dialogue that you use. And like I said, I'm kind of fortunate in the sense that because I do the substitute coaching, not only like it's very easy for us to get in our bubbles, right? Because we're in our lane, we're doing what we're doing because of just the route that I've taken in my journey. I've gotten to see language from multiple different private facilities. Plus, my time at VHP, we would bring in people from the college sector, the pro sector. And so I got to download and learn all of this, language models and linguistics and analytical stuff. And the hard part is taking a kid who knows none of that stuff, or maybe has even like what we call like training scars. And like you said, bad habits kind of from just either the lack of a language or lexicon around training. And then you have to try to build that up from scratch. And so, like you said, people will sometimes come into the facility and like they're like afraid to deadlift or they're afraid to squat, just simply because like the internet, the digital age does influence a lot of our perceptions of these things with like, oh, like deadlifting is bad for your back or whatever. And it's like, well, anything done in excess of what you're prepared for can be bad for you, just like the lack of stimulus can also be bad for us. So we're always trying to balance between overtraining, right, and undertraining as far as that stimulus point. But as far as the movement expression portion of it, that creative part, I find that relating it to the athletes is what's worked best for me. So like that's kind of where that animal terminology came from, and I use a lot of those coaching cues now more so than when I first started. because if it is something that taps into that right side of their brain and deep in their like hippocampus where their memory operates, it's much easier for them to express like a mimicry or movement pattern of whatever you're doing. Like that simple monkey see, monkey do is something that's very powerful. And a lot of coaches I've seen, really good coaches, use that in like their warm-ups, right? They'll just have like mirror drills, right? With whether it's athlete versus athlete or the coach is demonstrating it and physically doing the drill. But there's something that goes a long way back to like tribal essence of humanity when people were like dancing around the fire, you know what I mean? To like just be able to mimic those patterns and that kind of dancing element to human movement, right? It's human sprint. They know how to kind of fight intrinsically, right? And dancing, like those three are like kind of natural patterns. Like look at like any of the like hip hop dancers, right? Like how you're telling me 5 to 6 people can synchronize their movement on beat in the perfect same shape, yet we can't have the same athletes squat to the same depth. It's like, yeah, you may need to help athletes with disadvantages out, like a taller athlete using like a heel wedge, or maybe even resist unassisted, like using like a TRX or something to help them get into a deeper range of motion because they don't have the compressive strength to do it yet. But I think that's a super underutilized tool, because it's almost, at least for us, we have to justify our own position of like, well, I spent all this time learning all this stuff and I have to make it sound like I know what I'm doing. And for me now, I feel like I have a luxury because it's not my main source of income and trying to, have this perception of what I'm doing versus I'm really trying to see what the coaches, or from a coach's eye, like what's best for the kids. And so, like you said, having the kids squat 15 different ways in one set, feet together, feet wide, feet medium, toes out, toes in, and letting them explore their own thing. And I'm not saying doing that with load, but like a warm up. There's something to just them being able to mimic a body shape and having a human relationship there, being like, defining what those feet like positions are. And like with, for example, the session I just did with the kids here, we're getting into like a deep tier plyometric, like catcher squat knee bend. And a lot of them, because they don't have the intrinsic foot strength, and they'll start wide base because they're getting a lot of that stability from their hips. And as easy as it is, I just say, pretend like you're Spider-Man. They've all watched Spider-Man, and they all snap their feet together close, like they're on a post. Like you're just saying something like that that's very creative is usually the route I try to go with coaching cues to try to build skill with that mimicry kind of thing, that mirror neuron thing going on.
I'll jump in here. So I like kind of just getting on that verbiage, that train there. I like that a lot, actually. So like one of the things I've talked about a lot with my teams I work with is kind of the concept of like, the environment we're trying to create through verbiage, right? So for me, a lot of it's more of a learning focused environment, right? So we want to kind of be open to a lot of different things, right? Versus kind of rehearsal, right? So if I'm learning, right, there's an inherent like good relationship with failure, right? I like understand that failure is really important. It's something that I kind of need to do, right? So kind of jumping back to one of the 8 million questions you asked here, Dan, like how many variations do we need, right? So how many squat variations, how many do things like that? So I think a lot of the stuff for me from a programming standpoint is again, it's based on this exploration, right? So we're trying a bunch of different things. We're doing some different stuff, but also it's kind of linked to that challenge point hypothesis or theory, right? Where it's like, at a certain point, like if we're doing things and they're not failing enough, then we know it's probably too simple for them, right? It's not complex enough. We probably need to add some inherent challenge, right? So to the point that you made, Sam, like, like there is probably a high level of challenge if I'm looking for a specific bandwidth of like how I want them to perform that deep tier squat, right? So there's an element where like, one variation of that's probably like too challenging and then one variation is too simple. So how do I kind of fit in the middle where I can again try some things, but I'm not inherently always succeeding or always failing, right? I think there's definitely a bandwidth there, especially with the younger athletes. And even I think in the college level too, kind of really developing on that kind of stuff. Now, kind of jumping to one of the other questions, one of the other topics for me is, we talk a lot about, how these athletes, especially in the high school level, they develop so quickly, right? So it's like the skill is really like outweighing the strength and conditioning portion or like the movement patterns or a lot of these typical positions for me. I would say like the thing I would argue the most for that is like, there's just a lot more time invested, right? So it's like, once the first time you picked up a baseball bat or lacrosse stick or whatever ends up being, right, you've put like hours and hours and hours of doing that. But you've also been in a lot of different situations, right? So like, when you talk again, going back to the challenge level, challenge point kind of hypothesis here, it's like the level of challenge is constantly adapting, like for these athletes, especially the highest tier ones. Like I remember I played soccer at a like not impressive level, but it's like, when I first started playing high school, it was like, man, like these 18-year-old seniors, like they were kicking my ass. I mean, I was like 15, Like I was small, I was underdeveloped, all that stuff, but it's like I had to get way better to compete with them. And then by the point, like that I'm a senior playing like any like inner city, like high school soccer, it's like, it just isn't really that challenging because the best competition I'm getting from my team just comparatively, right, from that standpoint. But I think like there's a lot of just development and doing different things. But I also think when it comes to like actually developing the skills, right, so the strength conditioning, the movement, like, things that we're looking for, I think a lot of times when you talk about sport specificity, like, Franz Bosch talks about this a lot, but like overload and specificity are in contrast, right? So when I talk about like kind of relating this back to like the squat as an example, like for me within programming, like I kind of want that one moneymaker exercise that I'm looking for an overload standpoint. Like I'm looking for stability. I'm looking to really kind of create an effective stimulus with this movement, right? So that's kind of like a big staple for me. And that's a lot of like my big building blocks for my programs, right? But then realistically for a lot of my accessory work or my prep work, kind of like what Tim alluded to also, it's like I'm trying to inherently create a ton of variation, but then I'm also using a lot of my prep work to teach me more about the athletes, right? So I do a lot of like mirroring to that point and PVC, like avoidance work and that kind of stuff. And for me, it's the not shitty FMS, right? It's the like, okay, like I see where they like, when we do a bunch of crawling, I was talking to one of my sparring last week about this, like, it's like you favor this side, like you don't extend your hips super well. It's like, okay, I've learned way more from moving a PVC pipe like a fucking weirdo, like in 20 seconds, like about you than I would if I had taken you through some like random assessment or whatever. And then we kind of like utilize that, right? So you see what they need and then we can develop that. And I could go on and on about this, so I'll stop talking, but that's kind of just where my mind went.
I'll build off that and then using Eric's line, an inch deep and a mile long. So there's also this pressure or feel and need from parents and external where they want to pay for the private lessons. They want to assume because this person is coaching high school that then this person that played professional knows more than them because they played and performed at a higher level. But as we know from experience, just because you were a great performer and athlete doesn't necessarily make you the best coach. A lot of the tools that you're really good at, they came to you easy, and kids are coming to you because those skills are not coming to them as easy. So there's a lot of disconnect there. And the time invested, we could say that getting generally prepared, getting strong, working on our coordination within our sprints without the sports specific equipment, that builds coordination and makes you more coachable. So you're more self-aware. You now are better coordinated, mind-muscle connection. So when a sport coach does ask you to make a minor adjustment, you have the ability and the connection to do so because you've squatted 100 times. You've done thousands of push-ups. You've just done general physical preparedness, built coordination without the specific sports utensil, and now you're more coachable athlete. So if we're able to increase our athletic envelope, we're in a better position to coach more coachable kids. So it's too easy. It's too general. It's too simple. So no one wants to buy it. Unfortunately, it's not sexy, but we know it works and we bring passion to it. And that's what gains buy-in from certain individuals that allows it. I imagine all of us on the call here, we're not the best athletes on our team, but we were one of the hardest workers. So then we outworked the athletes that stuff came natural to, and that led to us getting playing time and having success. It's a tale as old as time, leaning into the intangibles, the behaviors, and why those things connected to squats, push-ups, lunges, all the basic stuff can help hand off great coachable kids that are going to earn more playing time because they're willing and able to listen and take instructions from a coach. So it's aiming to connect the general preparedness and what's showing up to training, not necessarily your sport specific practice, what's showing up to training and working out and being a great teammate and leader in the weight room does and positions you on the team. So I love that quote from Eric, inch deep and a mile long. Well, how deep can we start to dig those trenches for these kids that there's no question that coach can trust them to even lead the team through the warm-up, lead the team through the sprints and the runs. If the run's got to go off campus, and go for miles away from coach's eyes because we know they're not running it, then okay, we can help create those kids by leaning into these intangibles.
Absolutely. No, I think those are all great points. And I realize there's probably a million different directions we can take this, and just kind of going one at a time here. Tim, you brought up the whole concept of language and linguistics and what we use with the athletes, how we say it, how we present it. And even Tex, you kind of built on that in relation to how we build self-awareness within the athlete that way, because ultimately my goal is to not have to say anything and they just get it. They just course correct themselves because of how deep they've dug that trench within a movement pattern. They just know instinctively when it's good versus when it's not good and correct it when it's not good. However, it takes a lot of repetition to get there. It takes a lot of time to get there. And I think this is an area where I see so much debate in the coaching space. Some coaches get obsessed with cueing athletes, so much so that they've got like a book of 30 different cues they use for one simple thing, whereas others actually don't cue at all. And a lot of them actually go a little bit more on the environmental side and develop a more constraints-based approach where they set it up in a means that is impossible for the athlete to do the movement pattern in an incorrect or improper way, or in a pattern that is less than what they want it to look like, if you will. I think it's ultimately a continuum of how much language do we give, how much feedback do we give the athletes that we're working with to develop their skill through a pattern versus how little do we give. And I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts in relation to that continuum of constantly providing feedback, cueing, and so on that way, versus almost never providing any form of feedback, even if it's nonverbal that way. Where do we kind of sit in that in relation to skill acquisition? And what kind of tactics and strategies have you seen of value in developing those skills through a verbal or nonverbal cueing, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dan. And building off of what you kind of said, Tex, I'm sure you guys have probably read this book, but for the people that end up listening to this podcast to help compartmentalize some of it is Fergus Connolly's Game Changers, right? Especially like I try to push that one on parents a little bit because it does break down that athletic model into tactical, technical, physical, and psychological, right? And so when people come to us, especially in the private sector, and our job is to sell them, obviously, a lot of people that, in my opinion, that lean heavily on the cueing side, and especially I see it in this area with people who get protective over their athletes and their methodology and all of these things is, you know, they know that's how that's their consumer. They need a client to be reliant upon them in that model and system and ecosystem. Again, I kind of come at it from a different angle because I'm doing it for passion a little bit more so than a full-time bread and butter business. But I try to explain it to people when I'm selling them is like, look, I've done this as an athlete for over 15 years. I wasn't the best baseball skill player, but I learned enough about this and was passionate enough about this early on that I was able to max out the physical attributes, and the max physical attributes will cover for a multitude of sport specific skill sins. And then eventually, if you find a good skill coach or you find the right team that can help foster development, then you have the best of both worlds. But really, we're trying to expedite that process because, like you said, to get to all of these points, it takes a lot of time, a lot of repetitions. And for me, I'm trying to expedite that to them. And that's how I sell people is like, instead of, spending 15 years on your own doing it, maybe you can get to where I got to in 10 years and 2 years or 3 years, right? By coming and paying consistently. But I try to explain to them that way just to get them to understand we're mostly just working on that physical attribute bucket, right? Now, the bigger that physical attribute bucket gets, right, because we start to use the more scientific language like rate coding, rate of force development, right, myelination, like these words have meaning, right? And then the stronger you get in a general compound movement, right, the deeper that nervous system, that inch deep turns into, a foot deep, right? Because we see that all the time with a kid who can squat 400 pounds at 0.6 meters per second versus a kid that can barely do 135 at 0.3 meters per second. Like they just have a stronger, more tuned, like deeper nervous system to be able to now go out and learn and express and accumulate all these other skills, because it is an electrical component at that point, right? Which is why the general physical preparedness stuff is so big, right? If we can max out their physical attributes, then the sports skill becomes much easier, because you're not going to learn a skill when you're tired. So if you're just generally fit and you have good movement patterns and a good general physical preparedness for resistance training, that's gonna give them a lot. But then there's levels to it, right? So it's like that. It's great for, say, the 12 to 16-year-old, but then we get these kids that are maybe 16 to 18, and they're trying to go from a D3 athlete to a D1 athlete, and they're not the ones that excelled with the physical attributes right off the bat. So they worked hard to even be a D3 athlete. Where's that next level going? And I think that's where your question comes in, Dan. You're kind of fall into two camps? Are we going to build the lexicon and the language and like coach them through all these technical models, or are we going to rely on self-organizing theory, right, and that optimal theory of motor learning, where if we just have the right amount of intensity and the right amount of frequency, they will figure it out with enough of the right intensity, like the soup, right? Is it right? So they're not. That's kind of where people tend to lean, is one camp or the other, and I don't think it's one or the other, but I do tend to think the self-organizing model, when you have the right environment, right? So like a younger kid plays up with an older group of kids and they challenge themselves, they're going to learn, they're going to fail more, but that's going to help them fail forward. And as far as the psychological aspect of it within that kind of game changers model, plus two, they're going to realize their physical attributes are a little less than, because they're playing up, right? And they also have more time now too, because they're getting more repetitions in a shortened period of time against higher level of competition. So they're going to have to kind of rely on that self-organizing theory as long as they're driven, right? So that's I guess where probably people in at least the private sector, get frustrated, is when you have a mismatch of motivation with the desired goal, right, as far as skill acquisition and all these things, because there's so many moving parts in a field sport thing. But then you have a kid come in, they're 16 and they're behind with some of your 14-year-olds, and they can't maybe do a good squat, or they're stiff in certain positions and they can't do even like a basic like push up or crawl. It's like they're starting behind the 8 ball. So it's like trying to quickly condense down that scientific jargon for a parent and being like, look, the stronger they get in the shortest period of time, that's more motor units that they can recruit when they're in an intense environment to gain motor skill, whether it's swinging a bat or throwing a cross ball into a net, that type of thing. But it's like we're looking at it from a neurological lens first, and if you can kind of condense that down with the right language and not talk over people in terms of the scientific portion, but not undersell the years of stuff that we've looked into and read, and the importance of that underlying analytical information, I think that's where you start to find the happy medium.
That was awesome. I'll kind of approach it just from what I do personally. I'll try not to get too in the weeds here with like some of the theory that I personally believe in, from like the attractor theory and then kind of some of the motor learning stuff. But I think, Tim, you make a lot of really good points. Just one of the things I think kind of off the rip for me personally, again, this is just my preference, right? I'm a little bit more of an ecological dynamics focused guy. I think a lot of there's a lot in my opinion, just like too much on cueing, right? Like I think people constantly like over cue. I think that's kind of a chronic thing. You especially see that in strength and conditioning. I will say that I've been part of atmospheres where like we do minimal to no cueing from a strength and conditioning standpoint and from a sport practice standpoint. And personally, I just think that is inherently a lot better, especially as it goes to practice. I think if you can design things, and I just love to nerd out and design things from a weight room standpoint, and I love to I've actually been fortunate enough to sit and help design practices and that kind of thing to effectively help train the qualities you're looking for based on the activities that you're designing, right? So I think that there's an inherent, more of a stickiness, which is a kind of a term that people use, right? So it's like as far as like transfer or, like kind of repeatability of certain things or development in that skill, right? You see that a lot more versus kind of like, hey, I'm going to tell you a lot more like internally focused cueing, like move your elbow in this direction, like step, throw, again, I talked a little bit about task decomposition previously. So like kind of those ideas, I don't know that's like super, super beneficial. But yeah, kind of like for me, from a weight room standpoint, or just even a strength conditioning standpoint, for me, like kind of just jumping into data tracker theory just real quick. We talked about like an inch deep and a mile wide, that kind of concept. So for me, it's going to be like that meta stability, right? So it's kind of like falling into these different attractor wells. So being able to kind of move into different movement solutions very easily. That's like your ideal athlete, right? That's your stud who can kind of basically do a lot of different things, really easily picks things up, like all those different things. And then a lot of times, we go to the example we used before with like that high school kid who maybe is a little bit behind the 8 ball, or, this isn't really developed in a lot of different ways. It's like they're probably like limited tractor wells, right? So they only have certain things they're good at, a lot of things they need to develop, or they have some kind of like multi-stability where there's a couple things, but it's not super deep. They're just not really like developed, right? So for me, from that standpoint, when I look at a specific skill that we're trying to work on, it's typically like I just kind of evaluate of like in the bandwidth of what we think is probably like better, right? Better in quotations of like what is like kind of the best movement bandwidth or whatever. It's like, where is this person, right? So if they're like running with their arms flailing all over the place and running on their heels and doing that, it's like, okay, like for me, like some pretty verbal cueing, just like don't do that with your arms. Think about like, some basic cueing that you do for sprinting, like that kind of stuff is going to inherently give them a ton of value right away, right? Because it's just like the other example I like to use for this one is like when I used to work in hockey, like I'm a hockey athlete, it's like they'd always squat on their toes. Like they would just like inherently bring their heels off the ground. It was just instinctual, right? Based on like skating and doing some of that stuff. And so it was real easy for me just to be like, hey, can you just keep your heels on the ground? And they could, right? And then all of a sudden, like we just did a movement probably with a little bit more stability, right? With the full foot on the ground or whatever, right? So now I think when you get to the people where it's like, hey, like we're in a bandwidth of like, this is maybe not optimal for like, well, because this is what we're paid for as coaches to figure out like what's going to be optimal for this person. It's like, how do we guide them to a solution that may be more optimal for them specifically, right? So I think that's where a lot of like perturbations and then like basically disrupting the system, right? Having them try some stuff that's like so drastically different than what they've done before, or Dan, to the point that you made, it's like, hey, we're using that constraints-led approach where, again, I'm not necessarily like over constraining where it's like, this is the only solution, but it's like, I basically create an activity where effectively it's like, hey, I have a couple of different solutions. And then to that point I kind of made earlier, it's like that solution is going to inherently like tell me more about what you need to work on, or it's going to kind of open you up to some other, things that you may or may not have like previously tried, right? So I think from that standpoint, I like to personally do a combination of both. I actually tend to not cue a ton. It's like very jarring, especially for my freshmen coming in because they're so used to like, like, is this a good rep? Is this not a good rep? Like they constantly want the feedback. And I'm like, how do you think it went? And like that kind of standpoint and just kind of asking them and kind of building that like accountability for them in that standpoint, because I think a lot of times it's like, I'm constantly looking for feedback or this was a good rep or this is a bad rep and that kind of thing. It's like, and Rob Graves talks about this a little bit in his newest book, but it's like, it's that knowledge of versus knowledge about, right? So it's like a lot of them don't really like, they don't understand like what they're doing or why they're doing it or how it's supposed to feel, right? So a lot of that conversation for me is kind of building a lot of those different layers for them specifically. And so kind of allowing them to kind of build up and then being like, hey, like, is this movement solution that we've created together more effective for you? And then if it is, like, why is that, right? And just kind of building some context one.
I'm learning and listening as much as I'm trying to develop an answer. So this is a tough, but in line with cueing, I've got interesting experiences to share. So 5 years of my career, I was fortunate to be contracted to teach a sports performance for CrossFit. So travel the world teaching CrossFit coaches who are very enthusiastic about helping people and they want to get into coaching. So then they take as many seminars as you can. And the playbook from their level 1 certification, it was, if you see this fault, say this. So almost just this playbook of cues. When you see somebody moving poorly, here's exactly what you say. The unfortunate reality, like we're talking about athlete constraints, I witnessed so many coaching constraints that this forced coaches in. They remembered these cues, if this, then that, but they didn't understand why that cue for knees caving in during a squat. If I hear another knees out cue in a weight room, I've got such selective hearing, I'm going to lose it. So understanding the cues, that's going to be tip number 1. So first off, if you're just getting into coaching and you see something that doesn't look right, to quote Charlie Francis, if it don't look right, it don't fly right. So I can assume that wonky weight room movement is going to translate and transition to wonky track movement, which is going to translate to wonky sport movement. So I'm going to see something and I'm going to say something. Terrace rule is always in effect in a weight room. And I need to not only just say this direction and cue to aim to correct it, I want to understand why their body is doing that. It could be as simple as they just had a previous coach that never cued them to place their heels flat during their squats, and that was an easy fix. Or is there something structurally wrong with that ankle that then prevents them from getting below parallel, and keeping their heels on the ground. So instead of just saying one thing, if I can understand why their body is doing something, or at least investigate, like what Robert said about assessing, he's not doing a formal assess, everything's an assessment, then now I can figure out what cue is going to work, because all athletes, all different experiences, I need to understand what my words are going to paint a picture in their brain that they're going to connect to their body to move. So there is no magic cue. I think that's the one thing I want to people to remember from this little block. There's no magic cues for faults. Whatever you say to get an athlete to do it like you envisioned or believe that they can with their potential, that's the right cue and that's the right direction. That could just be movement. Could be cutting that movement in half and just saying, all right, place the barbell away. We're going to step forward in this single leg, and I just want you to send your knee as far as you can forward in front of your toes. Keep your heel flat on the ground. Okay, we're going to do that now on your left leg. So I can see if they're even on right and left. Can they do it just one leg? Okay, well, now we'll do it bilaterally. All different tools that you have in your toolkit, I would encourage you, and words are almost the last one. What different movements can we use to try to figure this out? And then I'm not mad at this. If forgive me, words are not the last one. Your last resort is using that mirror as a coach. If my words aren't working, then they say, okay, hey, like this, and watch me do this, and then show them. I'm going to try a whole bunch of different stuff. I just saw that too much in the CrossFit community where their words didn't work, and they're just saying knees out, active shoulders, but they don't understand what an active shoulder is. So then they say, oh, just watch me do it. And that was their only way of coaching, besides clapping and saying, good job. So now these are just my biases working into this, but save mirror for the last resort when you're on the floor. But pre-sessions, mirror is a great tool to show what the expectation is. So you show them and then set them free. But during the live floor, then going back to show, that's the last resort. So just providing some context there. Definitely model at the beginning, but when bullets are flying and you got 10, 20, 30, 60 kids in there, you don't have time to show every kid how to do a squat properly when you got 50 other kids that need you.
Absolutely. No, I think those are all great points that you all brought up. And I mean, Tex, as you were talking about different things like structural integrity of its joint or specific tissue, that way, in the back of my mind, I'm having flashbacks to our last conversation where you were talking about rocket squats, because for some reason, one of your ankles has what Kelly Starrett calls piss poor tissue for one reason or another. And it's like, we've got to find ways to work around that. We can always find a way. It's just a matter of how creative are you willing to get? And in relation to that continuum that exists around linguistics, Rob, earlier you brought up overload and specificity, and I almost see those in a similar continuum that way. You mentioned that they're in stark contrast to one another, where overload might be at one end, but sport specificity might be at the other end. And I think that's such an interesting concept, and one that's rather difficult for coaches to approach, because on one hand, if I'm emphasizing overload extensively, right, that's something that is still going to provide a very potent stimulus to the nervous system. CNS goes haywire, right? Especially, if you throw them on like a 3-rep max, 5-rep max squat or something like that, everything is just lighting up all over the place. But on the other hand, sport specificity is also going to light up the CNS, but more so from that movement and skill acquisition side of things, and less so just because there's 600 pounds on the bar and the body's trying to figure out how the hell am I going to stabilize under this amount of load and so on that way. So I guess it becomes a conversation of, typically I see coaches supersetting things that exist on opposite ends of a continuum, right? So take, for example, an isometric paired with a plyometric. One is high force with no movement. The other involves very rapid bouts of movement. And they do that to develop very specific qualities or increase post-activation potential or whatever it might be that way. But at least in my mind, I'm thinking about the neural impact of extensive overload and the neural impact that might come with a very skill-specific type of intervention or something that's specifically targeting a movement pattern that the athlete is rather poor with, and we're just trying to get them to improve the quality of that movement. And I'm not sure if the two go contrast quite as well as some of the other contrast type continuums that I'm thinking about in my head that way. I'm interested to hear your thoughts in relation to how we might pair overload with sports specific or movement specific qualities that way, if we follow more of like a high-low model, and what that kind of looks like, because at least as I'm thinking about it right now, I see both as being very neural demanding, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to I know you love your ISOs, Dan, with the ISO Fit. I should have worn my ISO Fit shirt, but slowing down to speed up, right? So kind of like you said, Tex, you got 50 people in your weight room, for the high school weight room for the day. You kind of have to do some ISOs, or you have to coach through a tempo, like let's say, a tempo box squat where the constraints are 90 degrees. Like we can kind of go heavy on this. We're going slow. We know we're working a certain, element of that tissue remodeling and like within these like parameters. But then there's also something to be said about like the contrast stuff where it's like, okay, well, maybe, I'm working with 3 or 4 people in a small semi-private, and one is 6'7" and one is 6'2" and one is 5'11", and so it's like, well, I don't necessarily want to do that with those 3 people because I can get more intimate with them. So maybe we do, that isometric, like deep, like kettlebell, like, third world squat hold in the warm up. And like, we're just going to hold it for 60 seconds and see how long you can get down in there. And then for them, you give them 3 different exercises in that setting. You can do that, right? Because it's like, well, maybe the tall guy needs a Zercher squat to a box, and the medium guy can do a regular back squat, and the shorter guy is going to get more out of doing a front squat because he has the mobility to do it. And you can do that in a small setting, but it's always something that you're playing around with as a coach, is those parameters and variables. I do really think that the way I always looked at it is the slow down to speed up. The younger they are, the harder that is to do, because it's like this inverse with the attention span, right? So it's like, I've worked with kids as young as like 8, 9, 10 years old before. Why their parents want to have them come in and do privates, I preface it up front. I'm like, hey, this is going to be like really, really good physical education they would get at school, right? Like a little bit more than they would get at school. But like for them, it's a lot more variation, a lot more play, a lot more intensity, like games, chasing, like building some of these other parameters. Whereas like now they're starting to get a little more older, like that 14, 15 going into high school. It's like, no, you're going to learn some discipline now. Like I'm going to make you hold these positions for 30 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever the ISO is for the day, and then we'll pair it with, something intense. Like, so it's something as simple as, hey, we're going to hold split squats for 60 seconds. All right, now you got to go do a running long jump and start to get them to feel that position of planting and posting off the leg. And I don't have to say anything. I'm just like, hold the split squat. Here's this long jump, and I set 2 cones out, try to jump farther each time, right? And so that's where you can make things a little simpler on yourself, and especially if you can start using the creative aspects from a coaching standpoint with your group size, right? Because there's all kinds of variables you're managing, whether it's training age, skill, as far as like weight room skill versus sports skill. I know this conversation is mostly about sports skill, but again, for me, I always think it's going to be, if we can build a language in the weight room that helps maximize those GPP qualities, which for me is always going to be, intensity, volume, frequency, and then obviously the movement pattern and movement sequence. And you're just on a scale somewhere between those 3 based off of your periodization model and where you're at within a season timeline and all these like larger ecological constraints for their sport or the time of year or whatever.
I actually, so like, Dan, I like this topic a lot. I've talked about this before on a different podcast, but one of the things I like from that, like overload versus specificity, like standpoint, just kind of paint a picture for everyone who's listening, is like, so the example I like is just a volleyball serve, right? So if I hit a volleyball with so it's called a volley light. This is kind of like what kids will use, right? So a little bit lighter and that kind of thing, right? It's going to look a certain way, right? Then if I hit like a standard college ball, it's going to, again, probably look a little bit similar. The weights aren't inherently a ton different, right? And then if I serve a setter ball, which is actually a little bit heavier, but it's, again, not so much heavier that there's like a ton of movement pattern change, or, like degrees of freedom are probably still pretty similar. Again, it's going to look pretty similar, right? But then if I ask an athlete to hit a like 2 to 3 pound medicine ball over the net, it's like they're either going to like probably have some like major shoulder issues trying to strike that thing over, or like they're going to have to come up with a different movement solution to effectively complete the same task, right? Which is to get that object over the net, right? So when you look at specificity, right, like the specific task as I overload via weight, it moves further and further away from like what is actually being asked to do. So I like that concept a lot, just to kind of paint that picture. The other thing for me with a lot of that is like from the weight room standpoint or strength and conditioning standpoint, like we're always going to be what a lot of people refer to as part practice, right? So you have whole practice, which is going to be like sport as specific as it gets, right? So volleyball 6-on-6, baseball, softball 9-on-9, like all that stuff. It's going to be actually playing the game. And then part practice, it's like, hey, there's just a limited amount of transfer. Like, and we realistically know that. I think that like there's a lot of gimmicky stuff right now about like this has more transfer, less transfer, like that kind of stuff. But again, like you go back to the example I said before, it's like realistically, if I'm trying to get better at serving, the best thing that I can do is serve a ball, right? And then you can kind of like add some variation and do that kind of stuff. I do think for me with these concepts, to that point, like I look at overload from a traditional standpoint. Like I think there's that progressive overload. I think a lot of those like force output qualities, different things that you're trying to look at from that standpoint. I do think in Bosch, like kind of mentioned this as well, that it's like you can create overload through variation, right? So I kind of mentioned that before, but it's effectively like you're trying to create like task variation, outcome variation, doing different things. And you can do that in the weight room setting pretty easily. Like we talked about, and this goes really well along with those GPP qualities, right? So it's like kind of moving in different ways, then developing different systems and doing stuff, right? But I'm constantly kind of creating the outcome goal is different, right? Whether like whatever quality I'm trying to achieve or which the manner I'm trying to achieve that, I'm going to inherently create a ton of overload by doing that, right? Now, for me, because I get asked this question a lot actually about like sport specificity, I do think there can be some things that are specific to sport, right? In a standpoint of like when we look at tissue preparation specifically, I think that's one of the things that a lot of people like inherently don't develop enough, right? So like one of the protocols that I've kind of come up with the rotational sports, so this has been like volleyball, baseball, softball, that kind of thing, is I call it a partner oblique, right? So there's like legs are on the bench, torso's off the bench, somebody's kind of holding those legs down. It's like we know that that is a high force area, right? So I'm like creating force, I'm like decelerating force, I'm doing some of that stuff. So like when I look at like at a staple for any kind of rotational force, like for me, it's like, hey, like this is gonna be part of the program, and then I'm gonna build some complexity with that. So I start with isometrics, then I go overcoming isometrics, then I do like, you know, reactive catches, then I have them throw things, rotate, do like all these different things, right? But I've kind of effectively prepared that tissue because I know that there's an like effective need for that within the game to essentially kind of prepare myself for that, right? So I think you can really kind of dive deep into the specific things, right? From that kind of like specificity versus overload concept. But at the same time too, like it's really important to like, it doesn't just need to look more like the sport, right? And that's why I kind of like brought that volleyball example, because a lot of times, you know, you see people do crazy stuff, right? It's kind of like, oh, I'm going to take this cable and start like whipping it like I'm throwing it, and, you know, that kind of thing. This is specific as it gets and that kind of thing. But I think if you're really smart about like, what are the tissues involved? What are the energy systems involved? You know, like, you know, you talk about like reverse engineering, what are the joint angles involved and that kind of stuff. And I think placing a lot of these things in different parts of the year is like kind of where you really create that specificity, right? And then overloading them with like variation and appropriate kind of standpoints, and even a lot of the traditional things that we do as sport performance coaches is going to be inherently where you see a lot of that.
The lacrosse team, we don't have a weight room. It's a club sport in Texas, so you're competing with other sports. So football doesn't believe lacrosse is a real sport. So now I got 50% football players. So at 6 a.m., they got weights. And then there's football period, which they're doing, and this is spring season, okay? So 6 a.m. weights, football period, they're either doing some more training or drills or something, physical activity. And then after school, they got their 7-on-7 to prepare for summer 7-on-7, which is huge, or spring practice. So full contact spring practice. And then at nighttime, we have lacrosse practice and sometimes games. So football doesn't acknowledge anything we're doing outside of football. And now I have the opportunity to ask for the weight cards and manage load management, right? Kawhi Leonard. So load manage these different teams. How I'm able to, everybody's overloaded, including the football players are just overloaded, but is true eccentrics. And Dan, you got a dose of this at our conference in Knoxville. So finding different mechanical positions and then doing true eccentrics where your buddy is your weight room. So imagine I'm laying on the side and it's a clamshell. I stack my heels, I stack my knees together. I pull my knees towards my chest and my heels towards my hips. If I just paint a picture of that angle, it's a good, I'm not saying perfect, it's a good athletic position angle, ready, breaking at the hip and the knees and the ankles. So clamshell now, open up knees. My expectation is to hold that position. Now, a true eccentric is you're trying to hold a position and force just takes it away. So here comes your teammate, and you're putting forth your most neurological effort. So football guys are still trying their best. Is it their best of all time? No, because they just ran through, who knows, snatches. Snatches are on our high school weight room program. Crazy. So now they're running through their best effort here, resisting it. Their teammate is now also learning how much force to apply, because it's force matches resistance +1. So I just need to overload what they're giving me. So now I'm gaining a lot of self-awareness and proprioception. If I'm a defender or an offender, right, putting my shoulder into a guy, I'm starting to learn my own strength. The athlete on the ground, they're targeting intramuscular coordination, rate coding, everything that Tim brought up, all the awesome stuff. So we're doing this for 4 reps in all different positions, not just the clamshell. And then they're sometimes doing a lunge jump or lateral step, vertical jump, or rotational step and jump. So something that's just general athletics. But then there are times when dudes are not clicking and they're dudes. Then I pull them aside and do the true eccentrics and then have them shoot. So taking away their perfect neurological, what they think is their swing, and then having their body find a different path when they're fatigued, when they're tired, overloaded, to then still be able to be accurate. So almost preparing for that third, fourth quarter for the dudes. So the whole team, JV and otherwise, is still doing eccentrics. What it looks like, though, for our freshmen who are maybe not football guys, they're not weight room guys, this is their weight room. You're going to see rep 1, it's like they're not even trying. And then rep 2, finally we get a little effort. And then rep 4, finally it clicks and they can put forth effort. If all of us did this as experienced athletes, we would hammer on 1, on 2, and by 3 and 4 it'd be like, dude, I'm sorry, I'm giving everything. I got nothing. So it's this difference that you can tell. The whole team is doing the same overload, true eccentrics, but I can tell who's advanced, who's done weightlifting, who hasn't done training before, and then everybody's focusing on that intramuscular coordination. Some kids are just finding motor units that exist, and others are really diving deep into the bag. So that's how I've found a way to don't have access to a weight room, managing 50 different training ages. 50 kids are, this is hour 8 of physical fitness for the day, and still aiming to, reduce risk of injuries, shin splints, and all the other stuff that we know exist at the field and court sport levels, and having fun with it. So it's a little bit mixed of everything that we've discussed here, and then it's a lot of feel. And why I like it is we're teaching situational and self-awareness to the athletes. Situational awareness is important because kids can get hurt doing this, especially when you're doing groin, butterfly. So now I'm teaching mutual responsibility, interdependence. This is a formal term called, where my performance is relying on you and your performance is relying on me. And, we're getting hands-on, we're getting close. So it's also a team building activity. And, you joke around, you have fun with it. You crack some jokes just to bring the tension down. Like, you got to make eye contact or else it's weird, like to break the ice. So I've found a lot of benefit over the long time that I've been applying these tools, and it's in line with all of this stuff. Yeah. Shin splints are gone for our team. That's mainly why I love it. I'm tired of hearing these guys complain. Just tell them to get new cleats.
It's one of the things I know you've talked at length about in the past is concepts of punishment, or I believe you like to call it punishment in your terms that way. And in relation to skill acquisition and motor learning or movement pattern learning and sequencing and so on that way, in my opinion, punishment by definition, and I think this is where a lot of people misunderstand punishment should be something following a behavior to decrease the likelihood of that occurring again, or at least that's what the NSCA says punishment should be. However, a lot of times punishment is taken a different direction and referred to actual behaviors of an athlete. Maybe they showed up late, or maybe they said a snarky comment or something like that. And punishment is looked at in a negative context of, hey, go do 50 burpees, go run 2 miles and come back. When in reality, that is not just, maybe it decreases the likelihood of them acting out of character again. Maybe it doesn't. But it certainly, in my opinion, does not set them up for successful movement pattern skill learning. A lot of times, athletes that are in these extreme states of fatigue following a ton of burpees that they just got slammed with are not in the best state to actually improve their skill. If you don't believe me, go to your nearest marathon and watch how people move before the event and then watch how they move after the event. There's drastic differences that occur when an athlete is in a fatigued state. When it comes to punishment or punishment, if you will, in relation to skill development, first off, how do you decrease the likelihood in your own coaching situations of things occurring that you don't want to occur? And second off, if there is some kind of behavioral change thing needed, how do you go about reframing punishment from something that could hinder from skill development into something that might actually help promote skill development long term?
When punishment's applied, it's definitely because somebody did something wrong or sport coach is frustrated. Punishment time, that's a timeout. What you don't want to do now, perfect practice plan, say, hey, 8 minutes, we're going to work on this. Then the next 8-minute block, we're going to work on this. And it's so structured, so the more character shaping that you have to do, the less time you actually have for skill development. So sport coaches, you have to make a decision. Are we going to be in really good shape or are we going to be skilled? If you're able to have doses of tools that get the message across, that don't take away and fatigue your guys and change their running technique and build resentment, because we've all been there. We've either been on teams or we led teams that when coach applies running, usually the fastest kids are just dogging it and going through the motions. They're not getting faster. They're not disciplining. They're also more likely to rebel and build resentment against coach rather than listen to them. So now taking it as a breather and a timeout, we don't have to run. It's just hit the deck, not for burpees, because burpees, that's also crazy injury. People and go through the motions. Don't even get me started. So just a la CrossFit. So now, if it is a timeout, let's just hold pillars or side pillars or dead bugs. If our back's flat on the ground, our legs are straight and our arms are up. Now I can see everything. I can take a breath as a sport coach. I can see who's trying, because either in a pillar, their butt's going up in the air or their legs are dropping on dead bugs. We can see who is going through the motions, and I can call them out in front of the team if I choose to, or just go up and give them a little taps and directions and cues to get up. And then I can also use this as an opportunity to find out who my leaders are. So who is going to motivate the team and keep them up? If I say, hey, we're only going for 60 seconds, but everybody's got to be up. And say, if I can choose to call out individuals to say, all right, Tim's down. Sorry, Tim. We're going to add another 10 seconds until Tim gets back up. Or I can say, all right, clock is at 60 seconds. I'm going to stop it every time somebody falls. So I can use these different tools. In my mind, I can only do 2 minutes, but I can pretend to say it's only been a minute, right? And target it specifically. So I can see who my leaders are. I can also see this is a self-awareness. Where do my guys go when the going gets tough? Do they choose to disappear up their own ass? Do they choose to be a jerk and resentful and say, yell at Tim for going down again, or try to bring Tim up? I don't know. But I can try to start to see where they go when the going gets tough and try to curve and coach that behavior. So that way, when inevitably during a game we face adversity, then we're ready. The challenge in using running as punishment, it's piss poor effort, it's piss poor technique, and then we're pounding and grounding, And then when you need their legs or you need their effort, they just don't have the gas. They don't have the juice. And guess what? You're even more mad that they don't get it, even though their brain's over here. So leaning into isometrics is an easy tool that you still accomplish what you want to. You can see who's trying, you can see who's failing, you can see how they try, how they fail, and start to build that up. So it's a timeout for you as coach. You are pissed. Those are long days. Those are long seasons. And then now I'm in a controlled environment where I can turn it into teaching moments versus just, I'm sick of you. You're going to run till I puke, like we all experienced in high school. So yeah, just a view on that, and using all the tools that we have in our toolkit and really unleash them on the kids versus just go that way until you get to that wall and then run that way until you get to that wall, until I just arbitrarily just stop a whistle because I'm bored, which that's what we see coaches do. There's no structure. There's no distance. And then that distance just messes up our specific strength and conditioning or speed plans that we have over the course of the season. And yeah, it doesn't help anybody. It's just a coach losing their temper.
Just to a little bit of a different perspective, just from that standpoint, like I think it's really important to note too, like a lot of, like, at least in the college setting, the like punishment stuff, like it's not as common anymore, right? There's kind of been some like kind of stuff coming down with that as far as like physical punishments and that kind of thing. I think a lot of times too, though, that is coming directly from your sport coach, right? So it's like during practice, like that kind of thing, whatever. And obviously I think like there's things that are excessive, not excessive, like that kind of stuff. And I have kind of feelings about that. I will say, like, from an atmosphere that I think has worked really well from a previous institution I worked with, a team specifically, was one of the things we would do is we would just kind of hold them out of activity, right? So it's like, hey, if you didn't meet the team standard of whatever it was, whether it's like showing up late or not responding to a text message or whatever it was, like we would take something inherently away that they liked, right? So it was pretty cool because a lot of this, inherently, you have to build a really great atmosphere, right, where people want to practice and train and compete and do stuff. So it worked really well with this environment, because we would just hold them out of practice, right? So, it's something that like they were bummed, right? Like they wanted to train, they wanted to improve, and a lot of that's like the environment that you're actually building to do that. So kind of taking that away from them actually like spoke a lot as a tool, right? Now, that being said, we were talking about like, physical capacities and those things as well. Like if I hold somebody out, it's like, I'm probably not putting them into a like inherent higher risk state for injury, right? With excessive workloads and like that kind of stuff. So there's probably some upswing to doing that specifically. Kind of on the other side of things though, I do think that fatigue can be a very useful tool, right? So it's when we talk to it, kind of again, jumping back to a little bit of like some motor learning theory and that kind of stuff. Like if I have someone who inherently does the same thing over and over again, and we're trying to get them to work on something different, right? From that standpoint, it's like a lot of times we see a lot of differences in motor behavior and patterning and that kind of stuff in a fatigue state versus a regular state, right? So if we can kind of inherently kind of self-inflict some fatigue, right? And then obviously, like I would agree with Tex, like I don't think, running a bunch is per se like the best way to inherently do that. But it's like, maybe I have somebody who wants to work on like arm swing specifically. And so if we can work on some like localized muscular fatigue, you could do this with like BFR or just kind of like band resistance, like different stuff like that. Like inherently, I'm trying to kind of create a new movement solution, right? Because I can't effectively utilize the same patterning or muscle groups or whatever ends up being that I'm using before, right? So there's kind of these new things, and it kind of destabilizes a lot of the movements. And the last thing I just kind of want to talk about too, I think when it comes to punishment and doing that, like one of the things that I've been a big proponent of, and then with some people I've worked with in the past, is the psychological safety component, right? So kind of just like building that from like a team atmosphere, right? So it's kind of like just this atmosphere where people feel like they can speak up and do things in that kind of standpoint, because kind of jumping back to what I was first talking about, like I'm not inherently like dishing out a ton of punishments, right? So typically if someone does something that I don't agree with or whatever, like it's really important to me that we build a atmosphere where like, I can have a direct and pretty honest conversation about them that, hey, you didn't meet my expectation, or you kind of let me down. This is going to be the consequence for this. And then it's like, we can move forward without any like resentment, right? It's kind of like, hey, this is just what it is. And it's like, if you feel some type of way about it, like, please communicate that with me. But again, like, it's really important, I think, to kind of set those ground rules and those standards and kind of like boundaries, if you will, from the beginning. And then it's like, hey, like, we're not doing this to like, quote unquote, punish you in the same way. It's just like, you didn't meet the expectations of the team, or, you crossed this boundary or whatever it was, and there's going to be consequences. And we kind of laid those out from the get-go. So.
Yeah, those are all really great points. I think it's interesting because we all kind of come from a couple different populations, right? The college sector versus high school sector versus maybe the private sector, which is all ages and all populations sometimes as well. Kind of doing my job now in the fire service too. The way I kind of look at it is there's like 5 variables when it comes to that punitive stuff, right? So that punitive stuff will be revealed by your principals. So if you're the coach, the sport coach in that setting, and someone shows up late to practice, or someone is not following team policy and all those things, you have 2 choices in that moment. You can either react and like get emotional, or you can respond within, good coaches, at least the ones I've played for, have, a code of conduct, a policy, like all of these infrastructures, like these standard operating procedures to kind of help build that team culture and team ethos and all of these things that build winners, right? And to build a good ecosystem. But that leadership portion, like you said, in the punitive moment, it comes at all levels, right? So you have the leadership from the coach, but then you kind of have leadership from, in your case, Rob, like the college setting was like, you're almost like a big brother, right? So like coach is like dad, right? And then maybe the assistant coach is like mom. They have good cop, bad cop roles to play depending on what the situation that went down is. And then like you said, like at least in the sport or the performance coach's mind, which is we want the most progress for them. Like we try to create that safe space, right? And like kind of educate them on those like leadership principles and like, and like you said, Tex, with like using, punishment or isometrics, like teaching them is like, hey, like this is where we're going to learn one of 3 things, right? What's your attitude, right? Your level of grit, and then how well you guys work as a team, right? So those 3 things, like you have a good or bad attitude, right? And that's where you can kind of report back to the sport coach, like this guy's got a bad attitude, like keep an eye on it. And if it goes on long enough, that's where as a coach, you have to have boundaries and rules for like, okay, well, this guy's not going to be a part of our culture and ethos, and you part ways, right? Like we have to have boundaries to operate within the same direction that we're trying to row the boat. And then the same concept too with like the leader that is building other people up, right? They're responding in that situation to like, okay, this sucks. Like you were late. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm going to lead by example, and I'm going to help build you up with like positivity and like, that leadership from a lower level, even though it's a player, right? That's the good teams have good leadership within their team. And sometimes depending on where you're at, you have to build that. So it's like, it might be a little easier, Rob. I don't know what it's like at Penn State, but I imagine you have some of the best players from all over the state or country coming to play. So you don't maybe necessarily have to deal with as much of that, negativity or lack of understanding of those social dynamics with team building, right? Whereas like, for me, like I work with all different backgrounds and both socioeconomic and age range and all those things. So it's like knowing when to be the kind of authoritative, like bad cop, like there's a time and a place for that. And then knowing when to be like the good cop, like build them up, like leadership type of thing. And even education perspective, I'm like, hey, this is where you're messing up within this social dynamic, and like pulling them aside with that conversation is something that you just comes with time and experience. I'm sure there's a ton of books you can read on it too, but at the end of the day, it's just, you'd had to have played sports. You had to have been in those different roles. Like, I don't know about you guys. There was times I was not, I was late, or I was, being negative or whatever. And I had to call that quickly. And I had a coach that stepped in and pulled me aside, or vice versa. Right. And I get to do that for kids now too, sometimes. So I don't think punitively, like you said, like running, that's ever going to solve a problem. It just wastes everybody's time and energy. So it's like finding these constraints within your social ecosystem that fit with what you have. And that's the beauty of it in coaching, is you get to apply your own personal experience with the personal situation in the moment and try to, row the boat forward as a team. So I think finding creative ways to like learn or fail forward is probably the best approach to it. I don't really think there's much about punishment as far as like just pure punitive, like, hey, you're going to run until you puke, does for anybody, because then it really just it pulls everybody back. I think the only time it's somewhat excusable is if it works better in the college setting, probably for you guys, Rob. Like, hey, this is our off season. This is 2 weeks of an off season conditioning block. This is the standard we're setting as a team for our ethos and our standards and all these things. And it's like, if it falls within a conditioning parameter and you're already spending those 2 weeks conditioning, that's where you can kind of start to say, okay, well, you're late. Well, you're going to, do a couple extra, and everybody will get to see what your grit and attitude level is. And that's where those things can happen kind of organically. But the rest of the time, when it's like in season, or it's a specific time of year when you've got things you got to accomplish as far as adaptations or sports practice plans, I don't think there's a lot to punitive measures. You got to find alternative ways around it, whether it's pulling them aside, pushing it off to a different coach with a different approach, or whatever. So.
Absolutely. No, I think those were all great points. And I realize that we could probably talk about this all day long. This has been one of the most fun, engaging conversations I've had in quite some time. And this is something that, even though we've talked about it for well over an hour, there's still so many more questions that I have and so many other topics to discuss under this umbrella. Did the three of you have any kind of closing thoughts, closing remarks, or anything that you want to share that's really helped you kind of learn more about these concepts that way?
I'll just say, like, if I'm speaking directly to someone listening to it that's a player, right, is like you have a lot of agency, and less when you're younger and can't drive, obviously. But at the end of the day, your career, it's up to you. Like, if you want to, people will come to me and say, hey, I want to play college baseball, or I want to play this, that, or the other. And it's like, okay, well, are you doing all the things it requires for your current status of your capabilities, physical attributes, all those things? Or it's like, do you need to go be a little fish in a big pond, right? And vice versa. Are you drowning in a big pond and you need to come back to like a safety zone and like find a private? That's where I find like private one-on-one training can be beneficial, because some kids need that because they're a little fish in a big pond, and other kids need to not be the big fish in the little pond, right? And then looking at it from a parent lens, whether it's like you said, Tex, like there's a separation that happens. Like, I have little kids. Like, I know there's a time period when my kids grow up where I'm going to have to be just, have some trust in the person that they're time with. So as a parent, really learning and educating yourself on as much as you can within the physical development process, and no different than healthcare, right? Being your own advocate for your own healthcare plan, being an advocate for your kids, physical development, and just making sure you put them with good people, and you vet them, and you do your best to be informed, and doing your best to kind of, do all of that, choices from a parent perspective. And then last is from a coaching perspective. If you're not, there's a continuum between doing things like all we've done them, like the traditionalist way. Like, there's a little bit of benefit in some of the tradition. But at the end of the day too, like, if you're not learning, going to conferences or trying some new things, or, showing some level of growth, trying to find ways to balance that out between, sticking with what works and kind of tradition, and then that kind of growth mindset, like getting out of your comfort zone, leading by example, right? How am I supposed to ask these kids to push hard and learn and grow and be all they can be if I'm not doing that from a coach standpoint too, right? Like, I remember doing strength conditioning, there were some coaches I had that maybe talked the talk, but they didn't walk the walk. So it's like kind of why I try to, do a little bit of best of both worlds. Not that I'm a great athlete in my older age now, but at least want them to know I'm not just sitting here talking about it. I want to do both. We're always in that same continuum of athlete and coach. So just to each person, listen to that little blurb and try to be the as informed as you can be from this podcast, and then insert that into your own choice option and ecosystem wherever you're at.
I think there's a ton of good points there. I don't know if I have any groundbreaking words of wisdom like Tim here, but just like a lot of the I think for me too, like to that point, I think like looking at it from a lot of different lenses is cool, right? So you think about things we kind of talk about. So it's like, if you're the athlete listening to this, or you're the coach listening to this, or just a friend of one of ours listening to this, for just kind of supporting us in that standpoint. I think a lot of this stuff for me is just kind of looking at like diversifying who you're talking to. Like, I think that's one of the things I think is really, really important. I get trapped in this all the time because like, I think the ecological motor learning stuff is super interesting. So I gravitate towards people that are like really into that. And then it's just like, I don't spend enough time with people who like, think the opposite of me. Right. And I mean, I do in the way that I work, right. There's like, I'm fortunate enough to be surrounded by like 10 strength coaches almost all the time with differing opinions on that kind of stuff. So it's just, I'm really fortunate from that standpoint. And a lot of times for me, it's like challenging them to like, it's like, hey, why does this work? Right. Why does the normal thing that, and this is one of the points for me, a big emphasis is like, just challenging what you traditionally believe. Right. I think a lot of people, it's like, hey, it's, path dependency. It's like, we've always done it this way. Like, I've always done this. I was actually like talking to somebody, a couple weeks ago, and I was like saying like, hey, like, like, why do you do that? And they're like, well, I don't really know. And so then I think that's just a really good place for people to start. Right. It's like, why do you do the things that you do? Is it just because you did that when you played, or is it because this is what a coach told you or whatever? It's like, what's your really full understanding of doing that? And I think like to Tim's point, like that goes different levels, right? That's the athlete, that's the coach, that's the parent. It's like really trying to get a true understanding of why people are doing the things that they're doing. And then I think kind of echoing that through just picking good people, right? I think like at the end of the day, like I think good people are going to inherently be better than anything else. Like you could have someone who's doing something completely moronic, in my opinion, but it's like if they're a good person and their heart's in the right place, I think you're going to get a lot more buy-in from the athletes and developing and doing that from a longevity standpoint than somebody who's, just a huge asshole who like understands all the concepts in the world, from that standpoint. So I think diversifying a ton from that standpoint. And then I also think just for athletes and parents and coaches who are listening, it's just, I always go back to that challenge point hypothesis, right? So it's like, are you making is the way you're designing practice or doing things in your everyday life, is it challenging you enough, right? Are you kind of being complacent with what you're doing, or are you really like looking to improve and do some of that, right? Because I think a lot of people get lost on like, what should I improve on? Like, what are my rate limiters? What are the things that I need to get better at? And then there's not a lot of development. Like I haven't seen a ton of it even at some of the highest levels, right? So I think a lot of it is like really being able to kind of like, reflect, talk to good people, like reach out and understand like what are the things that I'm not good at or I need to improve on. And then how do I specifically like challenge myself to do those things, right? And that's going to involve seeking out the right people and doing some of that stuff. But that's all I have.
Notes for the professional: get to conferences. Like Dan and I connected at a clinic, and Tim and I met at Summer Strong. So there's so many great people out there. You're going to meet maybe not like-minded individuals, but just great people. And then when you're in your work environment, I encourage you to be the coach that you want coaching you, and then be the athlete, be the student that you would want to coach. Are you willing to listen and learn from somebody else? Are you putting walls up that then prevent you from learning more? And then are you experiencing that from your athlete and get frustrated? Well, we could start to build some self-awareness of why is that athlete not listening? Maybe you're not listening. So a lot to learn, and man, I love the in-person. So I'd encourage you, get to conferences, get to clinics, and just meet people, because don't go there for the speakers. Like and we all know this as conference frequent goers. Like all the magic happens between the speeches, between the talks. And then that's where you get friends. You're allowed to have deeper conversations versus just listening to valuable information. Then you can discuss it or talk about problems and really, make some friends out there. So yeah, get out there, meet people, and take some rest, invest in yourself.
Love all of that. For people who want to find you all online, whether that's Instagram handles or maybe, we're in an older group here, so maybe Friendster or like AIM accounts that way, where can they find you all at online?
I just mainly post stuff on my Instagram. It's all one word, Tim Kelly SC, like SC in strength and conditioning. So it's all Tim Kelly SC, and that's where you can reach out to me. I love to talk training and help out.
Yeah, I'll go next. My main thing is also Instagram. You can find me at Strength Coach Rob. I was the first person to do this. Don't get it twisted. There's like Strength Coach Phil and Steve, and I don't know who else, but I was the OG for this. You can also listen. I have a podcast myself, so it's the Hot Takes Performance Podcast. So I've had some episodes and that kind of stuff. I dive a little bit more into like motor learning theory and that kind of thing. And then kind of the last way you guys can reach me is just like, you can just look me up on the Penn State website and shoot me an email. But always happy to chat with anybody. And that's email, Instagram, DM, whatever. Just love to chop it up.
Instagram's the best right now. And let just my last name at McQuilkin, McQuilkin.
That's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything Tim, Rob, and Tex are up to. This was amazing, guys. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Quick break, because if you're a rehab professional sick of burnout, this could be your answer. Engage Movement's blended practice model is a proven system built by Dr. Ray Gorman, a PT who walked away from the 55-hour-a-week grind and built a blended practice model that doubled his income while working less than 25 hours a week, and he didn't have to rely on the traditional way of selling sessions to do so. It's all about blending remote and in-person services, stacking monthly recurring revenue, and building a business that finally supports your life, not the other way around. This model isn't just theory. Real providers, including myself, are creating lives of freedom and flexibility without being tied to their schedule. And as a listener, you get free access to the complete training. DM my name, Dan, to @RayGormanDPT on Instagram and receive your free breakdown on the model.